All right. Hello, good afternoon, P5. I'm back to continue our read aloud of Carrie's War by Nina Bodden. Yesterday we read chapter 2 together, and today I'm going to read chapter 3 for you. Before I begin, though, let's do a quick summary of chapter 2. We met Carrie, the main character, and her little brother Nick on the day that they are being evacuated from London to the Welsh countryside, where they will spend the time that remains to avoid the difficulties and danger in London during World War II. We've also met a new character, Albert Sandwich, a boy who was on the train with them and ended up in the same place as they have. Miss Evans, who has picked up Carrie and Nick from the train station, and her brother, Mr. Evans. Very important to note that Miss Evans and Mr. Evans are not a married couple. They are brother and sister. Miss Evans is his little sister. It's important to remember as well that Miss Evans asks the children to call her Auntie Louise or Auntie Lou. We want to make sure that we know who the characters are as we're reading, and it can be a bit complicated sometimes because Miss Evans goes by a few different names. So, important to remember those. So we'll begin with chapter 3. Before we do, we'll think about the character traits that a lot of you were discussing after your reading. I asked you to think about what kind of people you thought Carrie, Miss Evans, and Mr. Evans were. And we can also think about what kind of a character Nick is. I think we'll see that the characters develop and change quite a bit through the course of this story. So let's keep our eyes open for that, because we're going to learn quite a bit about Nick in this new chapter, chapter 3. And we'll learn a lot more about Mr. Evans, because we'll actually meet him today. All right, so before I begin with chapter 3, I'll draw your attention once again to the image on the page. So here we've got Mr. Evans. We know that he runs a grocery store. So the picture that the illustrator has chosen to show us is Mr. Evans in his grocery store. It's important to think, why did the illustrator choose to do that? One of my ideas, is that it shows the reader what is really important for Mr. Evans is his business. And I think it's also important to think about what sorts of personality traits you've got to have to be a business owner. And I think in this kind of a business where he's running a grocery store, he's got to be very organized so he can make sure that he orders everything that he needs. He's got to be able to speak with clients. He's got to be able to manage the money. So he has a lot of responsibilities. And I think that's, for me, I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why the illustrator would have chosen to introduce us to Mr. Evans with this image. Yes, here we go. Oh, and at the end of chapter 2, we leave off with Carrie and Nick just about to fall asleep, and Nick shaking and shivering. He whispered into her ear, "He must be an ogre, Carrie, a horrible, disgusting, real-life ogre." And we'll begin chapter 3. He wasn't an ogre, of course, just a tall, thin, cross man with a loud voice, pale, staring pop eyes, and tufts of spiky hair sticking out from each nostril. Councillor Samuel Isaac Evans was a bully. He bullied his sister. He even bullied the women who came into his shop, selling them things that they didn't really want to buy and refusing to stock the things that they did. "Take it or leave it," he'd say. "Don't you know there's a war on?" He would have bullied the children if he had thought that they were frightened of him. But although Carrie was a little frightened, she didn't show it. And Nick wasn't frightened at all. He was frightened of ogres and spiders and crabs and cold water and the dentist and dark nights, but he wasn't often frightened of people. I'm just going to pause here because I think this is a new character trait that we're learning about Nick. In chapter 2, he seems to be a little bit of a baby who's not really able to take care of himself. And here we have something very interesting to learn. That yes, there are certain things that he's afraid of, but people aren't one of the things that he's afraid of. And I think this might come in handy to realize as the story develops. Perhaps this was only because he had never had reason to be until he met Mr. Evans. but he wasn't afraid of him, even after that first dreadful night, because Mr. Evans had false teeth that clicked when he talked. "You can't really be scared of someone whose teeth might fall out," he told Carrie. The possibility fascinated him from the beginning, from the moment Mr. Evans walked into the kitchen while they were having breakfast their first morning and bared those loose teeth in what he probably thought was a smile. It looked to the children more like the kind of grin a tiger might give before it pounced on its prey. They put down their porridge spoons and stood up politely and meekly. It seemed to please him. He said, "You've got a few manners, I see. Well, that's something. That's a bit of sugar on the pill." They didn't know what to say to this, so they said nothing, and he stood there grinning and rubbing his hands together. At last he said, "Sit down then. Finish your breakfast. What are you waiting for? It's a wicked sin to let good food get cold. You've fallen on your feet. Let me tell you, you'll get good food in this house. So no fattiness, mind. No whining round my sister for tidbits when my back's turned, particularly the boy. I know what boys are. Walking stomachs. I told her, 'You fetch 2 girls now. There's just the one room.' But she got round me. She said, 'The boy's only a babby.'" He looked sharply at Nick. "Not too much of a babby, I hope. No wet beds, that I won't stand." Nick's gaze was fixed on Mr. Evans's mouth. "That's a rude thing to mention," he said, in a clear, icy voice that made Carrie tremble. But Mr. Evans didn't fly into the rage she had expected. He simply looked startled, as if a worm had just lifted its head and answered him back, Carrie thought. He sucked his teeth for a minute, then said, surprisingly mildly, all right then. You mind your P's and Q's, see, and I won't complain. As long as you toe the chalk line. Rules are made to be kept in this house. No shouting or running upstairs, and no language." Nick looked at him, and he went on, quickly, as if he knew what was coming. "No bad language, that is. I'll have no foul mouths here. I don't know how you've been brought up, but this house is run in the fear of the Lord." Nick said, "We don't swear. Even my father doesn't swear, and he's a naval officer." What an odd thing to say, Carrie thought. But Mr. Evans was looking at Nick with a certain grudging respect. "Ah, an officer, is he? Well, well." "A captain," Nick said. "Captain Peter Willow." "Indeed." Mr. Evans's teeth clicked, to attention perhaps. He said, grinning again, "Then let's hope he's taught you how to behave. It'll save me the trouble," and turned on his heel and went back to the shop. Silence fell. Miss Evans moved from the sink where she'd been all this time, standing quite still, and started to clear the plates from the table. Nick said, "You don't mind language, do you? I mean, I don't know the deaf and dumb alphabet." Now, I'm going to take a pause there to talk about the fact that we're seeing some sort of old-fashioned language in this book, referring to somebody as a babby, mind your P's and Q's, toe the chalk line. So these sorts of expressions, I think, were ones that we would have heard more often in the past in a different time. Now, it's important to note that language is always changing and evolving, and sometimes things that people say at one point become something that's not really a very nice thing to say. And where Nick sort of makes this little joke, "I don't know the deaf and dumb alphabet." Well, that's really not how we would put that phrase in today's age. What Nick is talking about is sign language. And that's a language that people who are unable to hear or unable to speak will use sign language so that they can communicate. So now, instead of referring to it in that way, which wouldn't be a very nice thing to say, we refer to it as sign language. Okay, here we go. "Oh, don't be smart," Carrie said. But Miss Evans laughed, hand to her mouth, bright squirrel eyes watching the door as if she were scared he'd come back and catch her. She said softly, "Oh, his bark's worse than his bite, though he won't stand to be crossed, so don't be too cheeky, and mind what he says. I've always minded him. He's so much older, you see. When our mam died, Our dad had been killed down by the pit long before. He took me in and brought me up. His wife was alive then, poor dear soul, and his son is not much younger than I am. That's Frederick. He's away in the army. Mr. Evans brought us up together, made no difference between us, never made me feel my place. When we were naughty, he'd give Fred the strap, but he'd sit me on the mantelpiece to make me mind my manners. I've sat there many a time, scared to death of the fire, and my feet pins and needles. Now this is very interesting to stop and pause here as well. What Miss Evans has just told us is there's a very big age difference between her and her brother. And both of their parents passed away when she was very young. So her brother took her in and raised her. She's almost the same age as Mr. Evans' son, Frederick. And he brought her up the way he brought his son up. So he has this relationship with his sister that's a little bit different because he's taken such responsibility for her and there's such an age gap. So that might explain a little bit why she's so meek and mild around him, is because he has almost this parental authority over her. Okay, so that would be important for us to think about as we go on. She looked at the mantelpiece above the range fire, and the children looked at it too. It was a horribly long way from the ground. Miss Evans said, "You might say he's been more like a father to me than a brother." "Our father never sat anyone on a mantelpiece," Nick said, "and he never frightened anyone." Carrie wasn't really much afraid of Mr. Evans, but she did keep out of his way, as his sister's scraggy old cat did, streaking from its place by the fire the moment his feet were heard in the passage. Not that he had ever kicked the cat, Carrie thought. It was just wary, as she was. "Animals know," she said to Nick, "when people aren't friendly." Though perhaps in his blustery way, he did try to be friends with them. He never shared their meals, eating by himself in the parlor with Miss Evans waiting on him. But sometimes he would come into the kitchen while they were having their tea and say, "Well, Caroline, it's a fine day for the race, isn't it?" "What race?" she would ask, as she was expected to, and he would answer, "The human race," and nearly lose his teeth laughing. And he let them help in the shop. Carrie loved that, measuring out things on the scales and giving the change, until Nick stole some biscuits one day, and he came in and caught him. They had been there 3 weeks. Miss Evans had become Auntie Lou, and it seemed they had known her forever. It was about 6 o'clock, and Carrie was helping to wash up the tea things when she heard Mr. Evans's bellow of rage. She ran into the shop. Nick was standing there, white as flour, with ginger biscuit crumbs round his mouth, and Mr. Evans was shouting, "Thief! Caught red-handed now, aren't you? How long has this been going on? Sneaking in here when the shop's closed and I'm safely out of the way in the parlor? Stealing? The ingratitude of it! Oh, you'll be sorry. You'll pay. You need a sharp lesson, my lad, and I don't mind giving it. Strap's what you've been asking for, isn't it?" He began to unbuckle his belt. He said gloatingly, "On your bare bottom." Now, this is a punishment that he's about to serve up that, again, because this book was written long ago and is set in the past, these sorts of things we don't really see happening anymore, where parents are disciplining their children by smacking their bottom with a belt. This would seem, I think, to be quite inappropriate as a punishment. Nowadays, it would not be accepted if people were doing that. Carrie gasped. Nick had never been beaten, not even a slap. He was standing there, shivering. What could she do? Fetch the police? But Nick had been stealing. Auntie Lou? She was no use. She'd not even come to see what was happening. She was probably standing in the kitchen, listening and wringing her hands. She said, "Please, Mr. Evans, oh, please, he's only a little boy, not a thief, just a little boy who likes biscuits. He's got an awful sweet tooth. He can't help it. I don't suppose he thought it was stealing." "Well, then he'll have to learn to think, won't he?" Mr. Evans said. He advanced on Nick, who had retreated as far as he could, was standing with his back to the shop door and staring. He said, "If you hit me, I'll tell. I'll go to school and I'll tell my teacher." Mr. Evans laughed. "And what will she say, my young master? That it's a fine thing you've done to steal from the good people who have taken you in?" "I'll say I was hungry," Nick said. Mr. Evans stopped moving. Carrie couldn't see his face because she was behind him, but she could see Nick's. He was so pale she thought he would faint, but his eyes were dark and steady. 100 years seemed to pass. They all stood quite still, as if frozen. Then, very slowly, Mr. Evans fastened his belt round his trousers. He prayed for Nick that night, on his knees by the bed, Nick kneeling beside him. "O Lord, look down upon this sinful child in his wickedness, and lead him from his evil way into righteousness. If he is tempted again, remind him of the pains of thy hell, the torment and burning, so that he may quiver in his wretched flesh and repent in his immortal soul." He prayed for about half an hour, Carrie thought. She would rather have been beaten herself, but Nick was triumphant. "I knew I could stop him if I said I was hungry," he said when it was all over. "Grown-ups don't mind being nasty to children, but they don't like other grown-ups to know that they've been nasty." He sounded smugly cheerful, but Carrie was nervous. She felt Nick had made an enemy of Mr. Evans, and that might turn out to be dangerous. "He's not so nasty, really," she said. "You shouldn't have pinched his biscuits. You know you shouldn't. You're not such a baby. And it was mean to say you were hungry because it's simply not true. You're just greedy for biscuits. And I know he's nasty to Auntie Lou sometimes, but it's her own fault because she lets him be. She's nice, Auntie Lou, but she's stupid." "It isn't her fault. He is nasty," Nick said. "He's mean, nasty. You know he yelled at Auntie Lou yesterday because he slipped on the mat in the hall. He said she'd polished underneath it, but she hadn't. I was standing in the kitchen, but he didn't see me. But I saw him. I saw him move the mat so it should be on a slippery bit, and then sort of pretend to slip on it, and then start to shout." He stopped. They were in the same bed. He put his hand into Carrie's. It felt small and boneless. "I hate him," he said with a shake in his voice. "I really and truly do hate him." Carrie said slowly, "If you really do hate it here, then we ought to tell someone." But her heart sank. Who could she tell? Their mother and father were so far away, and you couldn't write that sort of thing in a letter. Miss Fazakerly? She had said, "Come and tell me if things aren't all right in your billets." But what could she do if they did? There were so many evacuees in the town and not enough places to stay, so the teachers said. The houses were small, and some of the children were having to sleep 3 to a bed. How could she go to Miss Fazakerly and say, "I'm sorry, but we don't want to stay with Mr. Evans anymore because he caught Nick stealing his biscuits"? "Oh, I don't hate being here," Nick said, sounded surprised. "I just hate him, that's all. But I don't want to leave. I'm used to it now." It seemed, in fact, as if they had lived there all their lives long, slept in that bedroom, eaten in that kitchen, used the earth privy in the daytime. Nick got constipated because of the spiders. Kept out of Mr. Evans's way, woken up to the pit hooter wailing, gone running to school down the hilly main street. Nick went to the local primary because he was still young enough, but the older children were given lessons by their own teachers in the chapels. Ebenezer Chapel, Siloa Chapel, cold, gloomy places with pictures of dead, bearded chapel elders looking down from the walls. It was quite different from going to school in London. More fun, Carrie thought, and was glad she hadn't been left behind, as some of her friends had been, in the big town at the other end of the valley. There was a new secondary there, a fine building, everyone said, with playing fields and a pool and modern laboratories, but it sounded to Carrie very ordinary and dull. She missed her friends, but she didn't envy them. though she thought Albert Sandwich probably did. He was the sort of boy who would prefer to be taught in a proper school. She looked for him once or twice, even went one day to the tiny public library which was in a room with stained glass windows at the back of the town hall, but she couldn't find him. Perhaps he had got himself moved to the bigger town, or perhaps he had gone home to London, as some of the children had done, the unhappy ones who were homesick for their mothers. Carrie's mother wasn't in London anymore. Her father's ship was on a convoy duty in the North Sea, and her mother had gone to live in Glasgow so she could see him when he came into port. She wrote to Carrie and Nick and said she was living in a boarding house in a street near the docks, in a dark little room that smelt of kippers. That's a vocabulary word that's new for me, kippers. I'm just going to make a note of it really quickly, and I'll look it up after I finish reading. Some of you may know what it is. I have a feeling that, well, obviously it's food because it smells of something, and perhaps it's a more common dish in the United Kingdom that I'm not aware of because that's not where I'm from, but I will look it up and I'll find out. She said how glad she was that they had somewhere nice to stay, and that she hoped that they were being good and making their beds and helping with the washing up and remembering to clean their teeth. She said she was driving an ambulance in the air raids and that it was very exciting but dreadfully tiring. Sometimes she went to bed after breakfast and slept until evening. She sent them sweets sometimes, and several pairs of red socks that she had knitted while she was waiting for a call at the ambulance station, and a photograph of herself in her uniform with a tin hat on. They showed this to Auntie Lou, and she gave them a frame so that they could hang it in their bedroom. But they didn't look at it much. It was a good likeness of their mother, and she was smiling at them, but she didn't belong in the Evanses' house. Like their father, and Millie, their help, who was working in a munitions factory, and Bongo, their dog, their mother hadn't said what had happened to him, she belonged to someone else. She belonged somewhere else, somewhere far away and long ago, in a dream, in another life. I'm going to stop there for today because I think this is a really important part for us to pause and reflect on. So, Carrie and Nick have now been separated from their parents for quite some time. Their father is a naval officer, so I think we can assume that he's involved in the war efforts. And she, the mother, has gone to Glasgow and is driving an ambulance. Now, the photo that she sent to them, it's interesting that the narrator has said that it's not something that Carrie and Nick really wanted to look at that often because it felt like she didn't belong in the Evanses' house. I would like you to maybe think about that for a moment. I know that when I'm separated from people that I really care about, I like to have pictures of them around so that I can look at the pictures and think about them. Maybe there's a negative feeling that can be associated with this as well that Carrie and Nick are feeling now when they look at the picture of their mother. And I think that's something I'd like you to think about, and we can discuss it on Monday. So again, the question is, why wouldn't Carrie and Nick want to look at this photo of their mother? Why does it feel like she doesn't belong in the Evanses' house? And why does it feel like something that she belongs somewhere far away, more in a dreamy place? And what does that say about how Carrie and Nick are managing their new situation? All right, so we'll stop there. I'll make a new video on Monday for you. And I hope that you have an excellent weekend. This is the end of our first week of being in confinement. And I keep saying it, but I really think it's important that you know that I'm really quite proud of all of you for how hard you're working, especially the fact that you're working autonomously and from home. And I think that we have to continue to look at the positive sides of this. You're learning a lot of new skills by having to work at home and interact with me on the computer. And really be independent. Come forward with questions and ask them since we're not in a classroom context. So really well done. And I look forward to continuing to read with you on Monday. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and that you get some much deserved rest. All right, so have a great weekend and I will see you Monday. 5p5.